Now that it's been a year, I want to talk about Solar Power, Lorde's third album, and the follow-up to her critically acclaimed magnum opus, Melodrama. Everyone has a take on this flawed yet interesting record, some going as far as calling it an outright disaster, and others calling it a worthy addition to Lorde's canon as an artist. I'm gonna run down the lead up to the era, and more or less why I think Solar Power ended up the way it did. A lot of it has to do with timing, context, and ultimately the content that she put out herself. Let's flash back to 2018. The Melodrama era is in full swing. Melodrama, her sophomore effort, was lauded critically. Lorde was doing an extensive world tour. She honestly was robbed from winning Album of the Year at the Grammys that year. The momentum for another project was definitely building. By Melodrama's second anniversary, Lorde teased that the album was in the oven. Infamously, I must add. A huge turning point for the album's content itself occurred when Pearl, Lorde's dog, died, causing her to really recalibrate what this record meant to her. We see this in the inclusion of Big Star. Just before the pandemic started, Lorde mentioned that the album had been in the works as there had been recording sessions in December of 2019 with Jack Antonoff. Lorde would go on to say that she had a very strong hand in the production and the sound of the record, and that it wouldn't contain any quote-unquote smashes. Then, for the most part, it was radio silence. Hype for the album never stopped. An account called "Did Lorde Release a New Album Today?" amassed nearly 55,000 followers before Solar Power's release. Flash forward to June 2022, when the titular track off Solar Power was released as its first single after being leaked. This track ultimately set the tone for the record, showing that Lorde was abandoning the electro-pop sheen that she was known for a more indie folk pop sound. While it was critically acclaimed, the song stalled at 64 on the Hot 100. Two singles followed shortly after: Stoned at the Nail Salon, a soft ballad that further spoke to Lorde's shift in sound while being more contemplative than the last record. It received mixed reception, some praising its lyrics and others calling it an aimless retread of Lana Del Rey's Wild at Heart. Though, hearing it live, it has become one of my personal favorite tracks. The last single before the album drop was Mood Ring, which at one point was supposed to be the lead single if rumors are to be believed. This upbeat satire on wellness culture gave us a striking music video with a blonde, witchy Lorde. Both of these singles unfortunately failed to impact the charts. The album in whole dropped on a literal solar eclipse on August 20th. It hit the top 5 of the Hot 200 due to Billboard refusing to count Lorde's musical boxes with digital download codes for the record. Lorde chose to not press any CDs as they are bad for the environment and contradictory to the message of the record. Critical response was generally positive. NME actually gave it a perfect score, calling it a masterpiece. However, negative reviews went in, calling it self-indulgent, disappointing, and extremely short-sighted. Line of Best Fit called it a tired old story, hearing about a rich white woman discovering crystals, then raving about the planet, peace, and love. Ouch. Even Ella herself addressed the reception in an email, saying that it's clearly one of those works that gets made between peaks, the kind that's necessary for makers sometimes, no less precious. In fact, there can't be peaks without such works. With all of that out of the way, I want to dissect why I think Solar Power was such a polarizing record. I'm just gonna jump into it. This record failed to splash the way the other records did because it's such a niche and hyper-specific album. Pure Heroine and Melodrama were records that really touched on universal experiences, the NUI of being a suburban teen for Pure Heroine, the immortal formative concept of losing your first love while moving to a new city for Melodrama. Solar Power covers Lorde's life at a time where life varies so much from person to person. There are no real benchmarks to being a mid-20s-year-old person. I should know, I'm her age. At 25, people our age are getting married, getting divorced, moving to new cities. They're either stuck in their hometowns. There's no real solid path. Solar Power is a record that isn't thematically cohesive as much as it's a rumination and a bunch of odd thoughts that she's had. It's probably her most personal record to date, as she jumps from being stoned at a nail salon to singing about her much older boyfriend to lamenting her dead dog. None of which are things that we can really cling to or find ourselves in unless we so happen to be Lorde herself. It's honestly the bravest thing that she's done artistically, in that she's rejecting what made her so famous in the first place, her relatability. Lorde's fan base is built up of people who really listened to her records and saw themselves reflected in them. Who hasn't cried their eyes out to Liability? Who hasn't realized that they're getting older to Ribs? I mean, who hasn't listened to Supercut and thought of one specific ex? These songs allow us to really displace ourselves into her narrative and put ourselves in her shoes. Solar Power essentially flips the script and challenges us to really hear her out and understand her as who she is. Secrets from a Girl Who's Seen It All, one of my personal standouts off the record, literally inverts chords from ribs and serves as a pep talk to herself. The video itself is a Spider-Man No Way Home recollection of all her eras so far, and the portrayals of each Ella actually really differs from how fans saw her when the era was happening. Pure Heroine's Ella really seems naive, whereas like melodrama Ella is just super try-hard, badass energy. Finally, we get crunchy stoner vibes with Solar Power Ella. It's very clear that this record is the first record that she's made that really belongs to her in whole. The closest thing to a real thesis statement off the entire record is my personal favorite, The Path, which is more or less her trying to say that she doesn't want to be anyone's savior and that celebrity idolatry is pointless. Honestly, it really does add a lot of context to the Prettier Jesus line and Leader of a New Regime. I really feel like this is her personal protest record, except she's protesting against her fans, thinking that she has answers or any real meaning. Realizing this made the album click for me. Now, don't get me wrong, I still prefer the other two, but I can't say that Solar Power is truly a bad album anymore. I'll also be really fair here and say that I lend critics some credit. Solar Power being released in the midst of the pandemic did it no favors. Other artists were also releasing contemplative records that more or less spoke to our collective suffering during the pandemic. Taylor Swift's Folklore served as a poignant piece of escapism and empathy during a dark time. Charli XCX's How I'm Feeling Now, what I consider to be the first proper pandemic record, served as a salve to fans seeking solace in isolation. Solar Power is neither. While it was completed during the pandemic, Lorde's worldview and lyrics are rooted in a whole nother world. Lorde actually spent majority of the pandemic in sunny New Zealand, which had cut itself off from the rest of the world and didn't really feel the full force of COVID-19. All that being said, I think it is disingenuous in hindsight to cast these sort of comparisons when the album had come out. After having lived my first proper summer in 3 years, I can say that this record plays so much better when the world is actually an open place. If you went to a Solar Power live tour, which did smaller venues over arenas, you'll definitely get it. Before I go, I do want to talk about the music itself briefly. California is an underrated gem I personally clung to since I've moved to LA earlier this year. I think the hook is genuinely charming and a fun glimpse into Lorde's mind view about fame. Fallen Fruit didn't do much for me beyond its gorgeous production and melodies. The Man with the Axe is a devastatingly beautiful ode to a lover, freeform poetry rendered to life. Dominoes is a cute, summery track, though the vinyl version where Jack Antonoff yells cocaine is superior. But honestly, the bonus tracks are so much better than most of the standard. Helen of Troy is a fascinating look back on her career and impact on the field. Hold No Grudge is the real gem of the record. If there's any track that you have to listen to, it's this one. It's a fun track that recalls many numerous people that have floated in and out of Lorde's life. Ex-lovers, friends, strangers. It's an utter fusion of all three eras so far. This introspective jam feels most like the record that post-mellow Lorde fans dreamed of. There's still the beachy afterglow of Solar Power, but it's powered by the relatability of Pure Heroine. The final lines, acting my age, not my horoscope, guess that's growing up, are amongst some of her best lyrics to this day. In conclusion, Solar Power was polarizing for reasons both within and out of Lorde's control. Art is subjective, but formed by context and content. While I will never really be a Solar Power defender, I will say that it's definitely one of those records that just was dealt some of the worst cards possible. But I am glad that Ella was able to put out an uncompromised album in an era that she's honestly proud of. And that's a wrap. Thank you so much for everyone who tuned in. I know I've been gone for a very long time, but honestly, it's nice to be back. I keep on saying that, but I will be back with more content. A lot of you have been asking me if I'm going to cover Problematique, the record that Kim Petras unfortunately had to scrap. I am doing some research on that before I do my post on it. I will also be revisiting Chromatica as I approach my tour date. I'm going to the LA tour. If anybody is in LA, is a mutual, and wants to say hi, see me on the floor. I want to thank my subscribers, anybody who presses like, comments on this, people who are my members on the channel. Thank you so much for your support. And yeah, stay tuned.